Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz, Assistant Dean for External Relations at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Tyrone Freeman. Dr. Freeman is an esteemed member of our faculty who also leads the bachelor's program of our academic studies. And Dr. Freeman, thank you so much for being with us. And before we get into your areas of research, our students and our prospective students, they often wonder, how did you get here? How did you land in the academy as you have had your professional journey?
Well, thanks for having me, Bill. I'm excited to be here. It's interesting. I could look back over my life and see kind of evidence for what I'm doing now. I was the kid who loved to read, always had a book with me, loved ideas, loved writing about them, loved debating, thinking about them, engaging with others, thinking about, what they meant in everyday life. So those are the early themes, I think. And then when I got to college, I thought about actually going into PhD programs when I graduated. But then at the last minute, kind of decided to go a route for a professional master's instead. And so it was a bit of a detour, but that's what launched me formally into the nonprofit sector. And so I started working in fundraising after finishing my master's program. And it's actually, this is where the fundraising school becomes a part of my story, because one of my first employers sent me to the fundraising school, because back then they were just saying, you have to go, you must go. Took some of those early courses, and it's very interesting because part of me was there as the fundraiser trying to soak in this content, but there was also this part of me that was very attuned to the instructors and how they moved across the room, how they held their markers. They were using transparencies back then. Some of your viewers will remember that. But how they answered questions, how they facilitated discussion, and how they were interacting with others. There was just part of me that was just fascinated by that, as well as the content. So it was kind of like an early inkling that I was kind of interested in teaching and engaging in that way. And so that was something that was very important to me. And later on, I was very privileged, after working in fundraising for several years in youth and family services, community development. I came to the university and was a higher ed fundraiser. And then followed that up by actually becoming the associate director of the fundraising school. And so that was just a great honor and a privilege, and just the highlight of my career. Enjoyed, working under the great Tim Seiler and the incredible faculty there, and interacting with fundraisers and CEOs and executive directors from literally around the world. And something began to happen where, usually fundraising school faculty get a lot of questions about, well, how do I do this? How do I do this capital campaign? I would get those questions, but then people were very generous and very kind, because they would come up and they would tell me how much they appreciated my facilitation style, or how much they really appreciated the way I approached a question. And so those kinds of experiences that made me go back to kind of that 21-year-old who thought about PhD programs and saying, hey, what might be a next step for me? And so I gradually made my way back into the academy and worked on a PhD. And really the fundraising school, though, was my launch into teaching on a regular basis, and kind of that launch pad into the academy once I finished the PhD.
Dr. Freeman, you mentioned your professional journey includes serving as a frontline fundraiser, and I know you've done that for a community-based nonprofit organization, and I know you've fundraised in higher education. How has your experience as a fundraiser informed your career in the academy, as you're conducting your research, as you're doing your teaching, as you're trying to find an intersection between the primary knowledge that you're developing as a researcher and then as a professor, as well as the application piece that is informed by your experience as a fundraiser? How has that come together for you professionally?
Well, it's come together in a few ways, because one, I can relate to many of my students, because I remember I was them. I wanted to know what was going to help me do better on the job, what was going to help me meet my campaign goal, what was going to help me progress and do better for myself and my family and the community. And so I try to think about the implications of the ideas that we pursue for practice, and say, what can you take back that allow you to think more deeply about your work, to try something a little different, or to make an adjustment here that will allow you to connect with donors in a more meaningful way, or to engage with that board of directors in a way that kind of gets everybody engaged in fundraising instead of just a few champions who naturally kind of rise to the top. So, tuned to those kinds of questions of practice. I also want students to think about their own motivations, what keeps them going, what keeps them connected to the work, because it's important to have that sense of direction and guidance and goal. And so in pursuing different themes, whether throughout history of philanthropy or fundraising practices, I'm also trying to ask students to think about their own values, their own journey, what motivates them, what concerns them in the world, and then how are they applying themselves to try to deal with those issues, because I think that's where they draw meaning from, that they carry with them from day to day. Any job will have its stressors. Some days are better than others and ups and downs, but I think that sense of moving towards something, trying to accomplish something for a greater good is something that resonates with a lot of our students very deeply. And so I try to pull those kinds of nuggets out of the various lessons and modules we might engage as well.
Dr. Freeman, I do want to focus on your research and your teaching, but I would be remiss not to amplify your work leading our bachelor's program within academic studies at the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And I want to invite you to maybe expand on one of your last comments where you talked about you invite your students to look at issues more deeply. And I know when you talk about our bachelor's program, you receive this question all the time. What's the difference between nonprofit management? There are hundreds, literally hundreds of nonprofit management programs in higher education, and philanthropic studies, where the Lilly Family School is the only college of philanthropic studies, at least in the continental United States, if not the world. And you revealed that in your last answer when you talked about, thinking more deeply, understanding your motivations. How do you describe that distinction as students are considering our program?
Sure. Well, I'll usually give them a little sense of the landscape, because typically nonprofit management programs will be based in public affairs schools or public policy schools or schools of business even, can have concentrations there. And so say, if you have those kinds of interests, then, you'll spend a significant part of the curriculum engaging in business and public policy as well as the nonprofit. And so when you come to philanthropic studies, there's some crossover, but we're thinking about the issues of why. We're thinking about the motivations behind people's voluntary action, why they give, why they volunteer, why they advocate, why they associate and come together to deal with different issues, and then what are the implications of all that in a democratic society. And then understanding the role that the philanthropy and the nonprofit sector play in our society. We have dedicated business schools, dedicated government or public policy schools. And so creating a school of philanthropy says, well, this quote unquote third sector is just as important and plays a vital role in our society and in the world. And I think we're seeing that now in a range of responses to the current situation that the world is dealing with. And so really we're trying to get at, what's behind some of these actions and these engagements in the world and how they help to create society. And we also are in a position to ask questions of why from a standpoint of critiques, because philanthropy can cause harm. And so I think a reflective practitioner is always mindful of what he or she brings to the table and the mission and the vision that they're pursuing, but also the impact on those who will be the quote unquote beneficiaries, and what has been the role of their voice in creating that vision and pursuing that vision, and how do you enter into a community to supposedly be of help, but not do it in a way that creates harm instead. And so those, these are the kind of the big questions that we ask. Why do you give? What do you give? For what purposes do you give? And can this cause harm? And how do we mitigate that or take a different approach to try to minimize that and to create more flourishing?
And your expertise in research is a great example of that. What are the themes of your research?
Well, I think about my research as answering kind of two big questions in terms of what counts as philanthropy and who counts as a philanthropist. And I raise those questions because, for a lot of us, we have a governmental definition of philanthropy. terms of this, if the government says it's tax deductible, that's philanthropy, right? And that's certainly important, and tax policy is a big part of it. But if we think about philanthropy as something that's bigger, that's larger, that is grounded in culture, that's grounded in history, then it predates the laws that define our tax code, right? So there can be more ways to engage and help others than the ways that you are legally allowed to write off. And so I'm interested in exploring the ways in which communities and people have thought about their responsibilities to others and the different types of actions they take to help others, and the resources they might bring to bear to that task. And so one way I've pursued that is by looking at the philanthropy in communities of color, particularly in African-American philanthropy, particularly through the life of Madam C.J. Walker, who was an entrepreneur, but also a philanthropist. And while a lot of attention has been paid to her entrepreneurial works at the turn of the 20th century, she was an incredible giver. And when looking at her life, can understand where some of the giving traditions and practices of African Americans today comes from, because she kind of embodies some of them, and she didn't create them, but she inherited them in many ways, but represents an important kind of historical landmark where we could tune in and say, oh, what was going on at the turn of the 20th century that caused these kinds of responses and caused her to respond in a certain way? And how does that inform what we see today on the philanthropic landscape? And then I will take that and then translate that into what does this mean for fundraisers? What does this mean for donors? What does it mean for organizations in the African American community, or organizations in other communities that are trying to, again, uplift the vision and pursue a particular mission?
You talk about different types of philanthropy and who is a philanthropist. And that gets us into these very important subjects related to diversity and inclusion and equity, and helping us do our jobs better and helping us relate to one another better. How does this then translate into the classroom? Do you teach specific courses on these particular topics? Do you fold into your research into different courses that you teach? How does this play out when you enter the classroom?
Yeah, it gives me a way of looking at those important issues and helping to create them as an ongoing thread. And because sometimes we might start a conversation, and then, there's so many things we've got to cover, we need to move on. But if we think about it from a definitional standpoint, we can take this idea of what counts as philanthropy, who counts as a philanthropist, and it can be a thread that rolls throughout an entire course, and we can revisit it. So we can pursue different historical examples from different communities. We can explore the implications of philanthropy on different communities. And so whether we're looking at, why nonprofits might exist, or what historical role have they played, or how do nonprofits interact with government, we can use diversity, equity, and inclusion as a way to engage all of those. So we don't have to limit it to 1 week or one module, but it can be an ongoing thing. And I think that's a critical thing for the sector, because we need to re-examine practices and keep it as something that's perpetually on the agenda, something that we're perpetually working on, because it is such a large and deeply ingrained challenge and problem that it comes from out of history. It's going to require sustained attention, sustained resources, sustained commitment over the long haul, just like those annual funds, those planned giving programs. We can't just kind of get started and don't quite see the results we want at the end of the year or within a few months. We've got to take that long view and keep continually addressing them. And so I think I see one of my roles is helping to prepare students to confront those challenging questions and to bring those questions with them into their roles and their jobs, so that they can help move their organizations forward as well. Because a lot of organizations are thinking about how to engage communities they've never engaged before, how to repair harm that they might have caused to communities before. And that's going to require practitioners that can think very deeply about that can help build relationships, and can think about developing models for moving forward where we're not continuing to create harm, but continue to open up and provide equal opportunities for engagement and giving and associating and volunteering, so that's a more democratic approach to engaging with stakeholders can take place.
Yeah, truly democratic, and diversity, not just as a module, but diversity themes woven throughout a course, whether that's an executive education course from the fundraising school or in our academic courses at the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral levels. Dr. Freeman, what might one of those distinctions be? And I know there are many, and you've written a book on this and book chapters and extensive courses, but to give our audience a sample, and certainly there are similarities as we think about different demographic groups in our society, but what might be a distinction as our audience is like, this is fascinating. What might one of those distinctions be as I think about, let's just say, for example, donors in the African American community? What has your research revealed in that regard?
Sure. Well, one, there tends to be a lack of understanding about the history of philanthropy from this community. And so my research has really dug in deeply into that history to, again, understand it not as something that's new and recent on the scene, but something that goes back generations, that goes back to the beginning of the African experience in America. And we can find evidence, again, from the colonial era upwards of African Americans engaging in voluntary actions. And we also can trace even those back to West Africa, but prior to the slave trade, that there are cultural practices and traditions of giving and sharing and helping and organizing and creating family and community structures that continue to inform the way in which giving is done today. And so, you could take a popular example now of giving circles, which just are exploding and have been the past 20 years. And in particular, you see a lot of growth amongst African Americans, particularly Black women. And on the one hand, this might seem new, but then if you go back, there were mutual aid organizations, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, where people were doing something very similar. They were pooling resources. They might have paid a weekly due structure or a monthly fee into a pot, and then that pot was used to pay out social benefits to members or to care for someone's family who was sick or someone who passed away. Then the family of the decedent would get benefits there. But this idea of kind of coming together and helping each other deal with daily life and survive. And so we can trace those back to those practices. And again, those go back even further. So I think that's a critical example that sometimes people are surprised to hear or think about. But then when they stop and they think about, when I think about some things that I've seen in my church or in my neighborhood club or amongst the ways in which I interact with my neighbors, I can see these ways that we've looked after each other, minded after each other, and that those can be tied to the philanthropic giving practices today.
And all of us benefit as a result with that deeper understanding, that richer understanding across diverse demographics. Dr. Freeman, can you give us an example from one of your classes, whether a module, maybe a class activity, maybe an assignment that you really enjoy that helps bring out these themes and helps the students really internalize these important lessons?
Sure. Well, one thing I like to do with kind of new students is something that I think about as kind of the beggar's dilemma. And it relates to something that we all kind of experience, where I'll ask them to close their eyes and think about a time, they're hungry and maybe they're walking across campus headed to their favorite eating spot. And as they get close to that spot, they'll start hearing the clanking of change. And then they're confronted by an individual, and I'll show them a picture, and it'll be of an older man, disheveled, hair is not cut for several weeks, and wearing clothes that are very soiled and would present to us as what we typically would think as homeless. And he asks you for some money. And so I'll stop and I'll ask the students and I'll say, I'm not, at this moment, I'm not really interested in what you might do for this person or what you won't do. But I just want to know what kinds of questions go through your mind, or how do you view that situation? What are you thinking about? And so then students might raise their hand and say, well, I want to know what the money's for. And I say, okay, well, what concerns you about that? I say, well, I'm concerned that he might buy alcohol or he might buy drugs, kind of feeding an addiction. I say, okay, so you're worried that maybe he's not presenting as it seems, that maybe there's something else going on and might be some sort of con or something like that. And I say, okay, well, what else are you concerned about? And they say, well, I'm not exactly sure what to do. Maybe I might give them money, or I might just go in and buy a sandwich and give it to them on the way out. So then I'll throw up another picture. And this time I'll show them a woman. And I'll say, here's a woman who's in need. How might you respond to that situation? And sometimes students, they'll have the same questions. Then sometimes a student will say, well, I probably will be harder on the man. I would kind of expect him to be out there trying to figure it out, and why isn't he working and all that. I'll say, oh, where did that come from? Because it's a way of talking about gender expectations, right? And so then we up the ante and say, well, I'll show them a picture, just a horrible picture, really, but it's a woman lying on a sidewalk and there's a baby next to her asleep. And so they say, does this change your calculus at all, that there's a child involved? What does that make you think about? And then people who said they wouldn't give to either the other two, they said, oh, I'm definitely doing something with that. I want that baby off that sidewalk. I don't understand whatever's going on in the adult's life. That baby doesn't deserve that. So I'm definitely going to do something in this situation. And so that opens up this age-old theme, right? The worthy poor, right? Who's worthy of being helped and who's not? And what do we bring to those? What kinds of perceptions, biases do we bring to that? And how does that influence the actions that we take? So I say, okay, well, let's kind of take it out of the realm of kind of this individual circumstance, and then I'll show them pictures of other solicitors that they've experienced in life. And I'll show them a picture of some cute little girls wearing green that we would all recognize as Girl Scouts with a box of cookies. I might show them, some teenagers in a parking lot with a car wash sign. And then I might show them, a clean-cut gentleman in his suit holding newspapers and incense, right, standing at a street corner. And I say, okay, have you seen these kinds of solicitors? And they say, oh, yeah, those are in my neighborhood, in my community. I see them all the time. Or I say, I was a Girl Scout, or I was on the baseball team. We had to do those car washes all the time. I say, okay, now, do you have the same set of questions for them that you had for the individuals? I said, no, not really, because I know them. Oh, you know them. How do you know them? Well, like I said, I was a Girl Scout, so I know it's a good organization. Oh, okay, so what makes it a good organization? Or what makes the baseball team of the high school a good organization? Or the mosque or the religious institution that's asking for money? And so that gives us a way to start talking about nonprofits and the association with trust and the ways in which that trust might encourage some action or discourage actions. So all of these things kind of get ideas going and get energy going and thinking about those daily experiences that they would have come across. And then I try to bring it home and I'll just say, okay, so, we have this idea of charity, right? That, has a religious basis, Christianity, Judaism, Islam all teach about charity, and it's an important part of the identity of these faiths. This idea of being compassionate towards an individual in need, it can be kind of impulsive, right? You were just minding your business, going to lunch. You had no intention of helping anybody, right? But that could be a charitable response. And then we might pull out a theme of scientific philanthropy, saying, well, there was this movement at the turn of the 20th century where they were kind of fed up with some of those charitable approaches and wanted to work on a different level and wanted to say, well, why is that person hungry, or why is that person homeless? And is there a different way to think about or approach these that might be less emotionally attached, more rational from an enlightenment standpoint, and we can really try to apply science to deal with some of these issues. And so then that gives us a way of saying, now, what do we make of that? Do those definitions hold? Do you see yourself as engaging in charity? Or are you engaging in philanthropy? Or are you doing a mixture of both? Does one fit a particular situation better than another? Should we get rid of one in favor of the other? Right. So all of these things kind of get questions going and get students thinking about ways and things that they've experienced before, but in a deeper way. And then that leads us again to those core questions of why do you give? What do you give? How do you give? And what issues are you concerned about? So I like to use that as a way to kind of begin kicking off these kinds of questions. And as you can see, there's numerous roads we can travel down once we've laid that foundation. We can look at gender, we can look at race, we can look at class, we can look at, again, the working one-on-one, we can look at working more systematically, as well as motivations behind all these things. And it's always fulfilling, a student will come back every now and then and just say, ever since we've had that conversation, I don't take that lightly. I used to view that person as kind of a nuisance, but now it's really a moment of reflection and who do I want to be in this moment and what does helping look like? So that's one brief example.
Those are wonderful examples that are not only enriching and lead to learning, but also are fun in a way and engaging in a very deep way. And thank you for describing that here for our audience. And Dr. Freeman, your passion is evident and your expertise is obvious. How would you sum up then what success looks like for you, with your students, whether when you're working with them in the classroom, as you just described so well, or at other academic engagements, events on campus or academic presentation conferences, things of that nature, or even when they are alumni? What does success look like for you when you think about serving our students?
Yeah, I think about it as helping students really engage their education. The poet and writer Adrienne Rich said once at a convocation speech at a university that she advises students to not think of being at the university to get an education, but to think about being at the university to claim their education.
Mm.
And so I think of my role as helping students claim that education, something that will be theirs, something that they can use to really build themselves up and prepare themselves to pursue the questions and the issues of concern to them, and that nobody can take away from you, right? Regardless of what position you hold or where you might be working at any given moment, your education is always yours. And so I want them to think about these issues, think about what's happening in their courses, and do it in a way where they're not just checking off the list of courses that are on the website, but to really use each experience to kind of co-create with them learning experiences that challenge their deeply held assumptions, that challenge them to think more deeply about what's really going on and what kind of impact can they really have, and what kind of cautionary questions they might need to ask, and how all of this helps them become not only a better professional, but a better person.
Dr. Tyrone Freeman is a member of the faculty at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, where he also directs our bachelor's program. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz.